Barkas inhaled a slow, deep breath of the cool air through tightly compressed lips and turned his head to look at her. A heavy shadow of profound anxiety crossed his icy blue eyes, looking exactly like the quiet, unsettling darkness that precedes a dawn storm. Talia stared back at him, her drug-addled brain spinning. What exactly is going on behind that frozen, impenetrable surface? Was he genuinely worried about their unpredictable, highly volatile political future? Or had he finally, belatedly, realized the horrifying reality of what he had done and was now deeply regretting his decision to marry her? Despite swearing to herself that she would never, ever care about his feelings again, Talia couldn't stop the bitter thoughts from spiraling. You never actually wanted to marry Ayla because you loved her, did you? Talia thought bitterly. I always knew it. You are simply incapable of truly loving anyone. You do not actually care who is standing next to you at the altar. That was exactly why Barkas had been able to perfectly play the role of the devoted, caring fiancé for Ayla, just as easily as he could play the role of the noble, self-sacrificing savior for her. Talia aggressively rubbed her hand over her lips, where the phantom warmth of his fleeting wedding kiss still lingered, as if violently trying to erase his trace from her skin. To Varkas Laedgo, Talia Roem Gwirta was nothing more than another heavy, burdensome responsibility that imperial politics had forced upon his shoulders. She absolutely refused to be fooled by these pathetic emotional handouts. She would not fall for his meaningless, performative attention, which he dispensed exactly as if he were doing a starving beggar a favor. Talia turned her back to him, violently yanked the thick duvet entirely over her head, and curled into a tight ball. Eventually, the massive amount of heavy vintage wine she had consumed dragged her down into a dreamless sleep. The rigid, defensive tension that had violently constrained her body all day melted away under the heavy, dark intoxication of the alcohol. Lying flat on her back with her limbs outstretched, Talia floated peacefully in the dark void of sleep. Until a violent, freezing chill suddenly ran down her spine. It started as a small, sharp itch deep inside the marrow of her crushed left knee. Talia forced her heavy eyelids open. The bedroom was pitch black. The thick, sticky darkness of the middle of the night seemed to press down on her chest, violently squeezing the breath from her lungs. The drowsiness that had just weighed her body down instantly evaporated. Her heart began to hammer wildly against her ribs. Talia wheezed, gasping desperately for air, her hands flying up to clutch her own throat, which felt exactly as though it were being crushed by an invisible garrote wire. At that exact second, the dull, aching itch in her knee violently exploded into a blinding flash of white-hot lightning. Ah! Talia shrieked, her hands flying down to clutch her ruined shin in a blind panic. The weakened, heavily scarred muscles of her calf were violently spasming, twitching uncontrollably beneath her fingertips. The phantom pain was absolutely excruciating. It felt exactly as if someone had driven a jagged, rusty blade directly under her skin and was slowly, methodically twisting it through the bone marrow. A freezing cold sweat instantly broke out across her entire body, biting down on her cracked lips until she tasted fresh blood. Talia desperately dug her fingernails directly into the cramping muscle, unconsciously trying to physically rip the agony out of her own leg. Suddenly, the sharp clack-clack of flint striking steel echoed through the darkness. A second later, the warm, flickering golden light of a candle flooded her vision. Talia threw her head back, gasping for air. Barkas was leaning over the head of the bed, holding a lit candle. The flickering flame illuminated his pale face, which was drawn tight with intense alarm as he took in her violently spasming body and her blood-streaked lips. Barkas immediately dropped the candle onto the bedside table and lunged forward, reaching for her thrashing legs. Operating purely on blind, terrified instinct, Talia screamed. "Do not touch me." She violently slapped his hand away and began frantically scrambling backward across the mattress, desperately trying to drag her agonizing, spasming leg away from him. But she didn't make it far. Barkas easily caught her. He clamped a heavy hand down firmly on her shoulder, completely pinning her to the mattress and preventing her from thrashing. With his free hand, he reached down again toward her scarred shin, which was now bleeding from where Talia had dug her own fingernails into the flesh. Talia shrieked exactly as if boiling oil had been thrown on her skin. "Do not touch it. Do not look at it. Let me go." "Stop moving, Talia," Barkas ordered, his voice tight. "I just need to examine the tearing in the muscle." "No. I said no." She choked on a massive, violent sob of pure despair, her entire body arching off the mattress in a desperate attempt to escape his grip. Barkas muttered a harsh, guttural curse in the ancient Can dialect. Abandoning his attempt to look at the leg, he suddenly lunged forward, grabbed her by the waist, and pulled her flush against his chest. He wrapped his massive arms entirely around her thrashing body, completely immobilizing her in an iron grip. Pinning her tightly against him so she couldn't hurt herself, Barkas reached his long arm out and violently yanked the servant's bell cord hanging above the bed. A few agonizing moments later, the heavy oak door swung open, and 3 highly alarmed maids sprinted into the master bedroom. "Summon the manor's healer immediately," Barkas roared. The bedroom instantly erupted into frantic chaos. An elderly, disheveled magician sprinted into the chambers and immediately began casting a low-level ambient restoration spell to soothe the air, while the terrified maids rushed to light dozens of candles and burn heavy, calming incense in the brass braziers. Through the entire chaotic ordeal, Barkas absolutely refused to let Talia out of his arms, crushing her against his chest exactly as if he were terrified she would shatter into a million pieces if he let go. Talia, pressing her sweaty forehead frantically against his hot, rapidly heaving chest, looked around the brightly lit room with wide, terrified eyes. Every single nerve in her body was screaming in panic. What if the healer tries to lift the hem of my nightgown? What if they all see my hideous, mutilated scars? Sobbing hysterically, she curled into a tight ball against Barkas's chest and clenched the hem of the silk robe in her fists, holding it down over her knees like an impenetrable shield. She had no idea how much time passed in agony. Finally, the exhausted, breathless magician knelt beside the bed and held out a small glass vial filled with a glowing, thick blue liquid. "This is a highly concentrated narcotic painkiller," the magician panted, holding the vial out to Barkas. "It will relieve the severe muscle spasms almost immediately, my lord." Talia narrowed her tear-filled eyes and glared at the blue vial. "If I drink that heavy narcotic, I will definitely lose consciousness," Talia thought, her paranoia spiking violently. "And the absolute second I pass out, that healer is going to lift my dress and examine my ruined legs." She violently pressed her lips tightly together, shook her head, and buried her face deep into Barkas's chest, refusing to look at the potion. Instantly, long, calloused fingers grabbed her chin and forcefully yanked her face upward. Barkas took the glass vial from the healer and pressed the cold rim directly against Talia's lips. Talia clenched her jaw shut with absolute, ironclad stubbornness. She glared up at him, her eyes burning with defiance. Barkas stared back at her, his icy blue eyes darkening with sheer, unyielding frustration. Without a single word of warning, Barkas raised the glass vial, tipped his head back, and drained exactly half of the bitter blue liquid into his own mouth. Before Talia's drug-addled brain could even begin to process what he was doing, Barkas leaned down and violently crushed his lips directly against hers. Talia's eyes blew wide open in absolute shock. Still gripping her chin in a vice, Barkas forcefully squeezed her cheeks, forcing her jaw to pop open. He immediately pushed his tongue past her lips, sealing her mouth completely. The thick, overwhelmingly bitter liquid flooded from his mouth directly into hers. Talia gasped in shock, her hands flying up to grab the collar of his thin linen shirt exactly as if she were trying to rip it to shreds. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. The highly concentrated narcotic liquid burned the delicate mucous membranes of her mouth like acid. As she tried to spit it out, Barkas's tongue slid aggressively against hers, forcing the liquid toward the back of her throat. A muffled, desperate moan caught in her chest. Is he actually trying to poison me? Her tongue, her throat, her lips, everything burned exactly as if it were on fire. Huh. The forceful, desperate kiss, which lasted for an unnaturally long time, finally broke. Barkas slowly pulled back, breaking the seal. Panting heavily, having completely forgotten about the agonizing pain in her leg, Talia stared up at him in profound, breathless confusion. Barkas, staring directly into her blown-out pupils, immediately raised the glass vial again and drained the remaining half of the thick blue medicine into his mouth. And then, he crushed his lips against hers a second time. Talia whimpered, digging her sharp fingernails directly into the thick muscles of his forearm. His tongue slid aggressively along the roof of her mouth, slowly, methodically pushing the viscous, bitter liquid down her throat. Her throat involuntarily convulsed, forcing her to swallow the heavy narcotic against her will. Completely overwhelmed by the blinding panic, the intense shame, and the utterly overwhelming sensation of his mouth completely dominating hers, Talia involuntarily curled her toes, her entire body going rigid. Her head instantly began to spin violently. The highly concentrated potion had already begun to hit her bloodstream. Even after the last drop of the bitter liquid had been swallowed, Barkas did not pull away. He continued to explore her narrow, hot mouth with a slow, sticky insistence, acting exactly as if he had absolutely no intention of ever stopping. Completely overcome with a new, terrifying kind of panic, Talia weakly struck his chest with her fists. Finally, the sensation of his soft, demanding lips slowly receded. Breathing in ragged, shaky gasps, Talia looked up at his face. She was a blushing, panting, completely disheveled mess. But Barkas, despite the intense physical exertion, remained completely, terrifyingly unperturbed. His icy eyes were perfectly calm. His absolute, flawless composure confused her even more than the kiss had. Was all of that just, not real? While Talia hesitated, her mind swimming in the narcotic fog, Barkas slowly reached up and ran his thumb gently across her swollen lower lip. It wasn't until she heard the soft, wet sound of his thumb brushing her skin that Talia realized exactly how wet her mouth was. She let out a mortified gasp, ripped herself out of his grip, and frantically dove under the heavy duvet, hiding her burning face in the dark. A heavy, wet exhalation sounded just above the top of her head. Go to sleep, Talia, Barkas said quietly, reaching under the blankets to gently press her head against his chest. Hidden in the dark, Talia listened to the steady, rhythmic thumping of his heartbeat and desperately tried to calm her own frantic breathing. A few minutes later, the massive dose of the narcotic finally dispersed fully throughout her body. Her vision swam violently, and the edges of the world began to turn black. Right before the darkness dragged her under, she reached out with desperate determination and grabbed a fistful of his linen shirt. While I am sleeping. Talia slurred aggressively. Do not you dare. Touch my legs. She had absolutely no idea whether he actually heard her incoherent muttering, but a second later, a massive, warm hand began to gently, methodically rub her back. The last remaining tension in her body instantly faded, and her consciousness went completely dark. When Talia finally opened her eyes again, bright, blinding morning sunlight was flooding the master bedroom. She stared sleepily at the intricately painted ceiling for a few moments, then suddenly shuddered, her instinct screaming at her that she was not alone. Barkas was standing perfectly still by the massive bay window, silently changing into a fresh uniform. The bright morning light streamed through the glass, casting stark white reflections across the heavy, corded muscles of his chest and arms, making him look exactly like a magnificent, unyielding marble statue. Talia watched him in absolute, breathless fascination. Until his calm, icy blue gaze shifted and met hers. Talia immediately cringed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Barkas looked down at her. Exactly as if the passionate, desperate, overpowering kiss from the middle of the night had been nothing more than a feverish mirage, Barkas examined her with the exact same cold, impenetrable detachment as always.